This is my voice, my weapon of choice. This is life. This is life. This is a plate. This is a cup. This is a story I didn't make up. This is a girl lost in the wood. Some covered wagon from some other hood.
I think we underestimate the power of imagination. So many people can recognize that something's not working, but at the same time, they're like, I'm comfortable, or this is how it is. But I think psychedelics can help us start to envision a new society. Okay, well, let's change it. Let's do something about it. Let's do something that makes everyone's lives easier. No one's dying. No one's being harmed. And it's not as hard as people make it seem to be.
Hello. Welcome to episode 25 of Unbroken Chain. I'm Maura James, and this week we are hanging out with Ifeitayo Harvey, who is a total badass who works at the Drug Policy Alliance in New York City. This week she gives us an incredible download. I'm just so grateful for her. She basically gives us a very succinct history of the drug war and then helps us understand this current moment of transition that we're in, where half of the country is legalizing cannabis, psychedelics are entering that conversation as well, and yet we still have thousands of people in jail for possession of marijuana and non-violent crimes, just possession. And then talking about how these psychedelics themselves can help us transition through this period with integrity and really move forward by completely doing away with the drug war and reconciling it, really taking stock and atoning for the incredible suffering that has come at its hands, and not just shoehorning the drug war into this next phase where it still continues to benefit the same people and oppress the same people. So I want to point you towards the Drug Policy Alliance website. It's an incredible wealth of information. And just to kind of give us a little bit of context, I wanted to share a few statistics, which you can also find there and do a deeper dive on. The US annually spends $47 billion, billion with a B, on the war on drugs. And in the US, we arrest over 1.5 million people a year for drug law violations. And the vast majority, over 85% of those arrests, are for possession only. And these laws have their roots in racism, which Ifeitayo walks us through. The way that it's playing out is clearly racist. 47% of the US prison population is Black or Latino. And in our greater population, they only make up 31% of the population. And drug use occurs in all populations, whether you're looking at it by race or gender, approximately the same. So it's clear that there are a disproportionate amount of Black and brown people behind bars for drug crimes. And now 22 states have decriminalized or removed the threat of jail time for possession of marijuana. So something is deeply wrong here. It has been deeply wrong for a long time. And this is, of course, much bigger than just the drug war. The US incarcerates the most people of anyone in the world by far. And there's just no excuse for that. We terrorize our own people. It's vital that we all talk about this as anyone out there starts to make legal money from quote-unquote drugs, plants, any substance. And it's also important to think about how we can move forward in better ways, which is really where this conversation ends up, with Ifeitayo and I talking about how psychedelic medicines have helped our personal healing and also how they could potentially help our collective healing. And we're in this really important, special moment right now to really take stock of that and what it means. So grateful for Ifeitayo taking the time to explore this with us and sharing her own personal experience with how the war on drugs has affected her and her family directly. Buckle up. Here she is, Ifeitayo.
The reason I got into drug policy is because I witnessed a lot of my friends and family become victims of the drug war, including my father, who was incarcerated for 8 years and deported. And that's really where a lot of my passion comes from. I came to DPA talking about my experience of having a parent in prison and how that impacts a whole generation of children. And I also do some work in psychedelics. I am a part of a psychedelic coalition of people of color from across the world, and I'm excited to talk to Maura.
Oh, yay. I'm so glad you're here. The drug war is that could be its own podcast series, but I'm wondering if you could give us sort of a little bit of context to start this conversation about what you mean when you say the drug war.
Sure. So when I say the drug war, I'm referring to the set of policies and laws, mostly in America, but of course we've seen this replicated around the globe, but punitive laws and policies against folks who use drugs or sell drugs, which basically started with Nixon. Of course, we have earlier anti-drug laws in the early 1900s, but Nixon really kind of set it off. And the intention wasn't necessarily to stop drug use. Of course, that's what they said, but drug use has always been a thing in human history. The real intention of the drug war was to harm communities that were fighting against the wars, like Vietnam War. It was created to harm Black and brown communities who were fighting for their civil rights. I think there's a quote by one of Nixon's cabinet men. His name is Ehrlichman. He says basically the drug war was about targeting Black folks and hippies. It was an easy way to take down leaders in those communities. So now we see hundreds and thousands of people serving time in prison or jail for possession of drugs, using drugs, selling drugs. And at the Drug Policy Alliance, we know that none of these policies really work. It's been 40 years since Nixon started the war on drugs, and we have more overdose deaths than ever. We have more private prisons than ever. Women's populations in prisons have skyrocketed over the last 40 years. So clearly the drug war isn't doing any good for our society. And our mission at DPA is to end the drug war and create drug policies that are rooted in compassion and public health.
Wow. Yeah, that was really succinctly said.
Thank you.
Are you an abolitionist?
Well, I don't necessarily call myself an abolitionist because I think for me personally, I'm still working through a lot of my understanding of what it means to be an abolitionist. So I feel aligned with a lot of those values, but I don't necessarily call myself that. Of course, I think prisons are terrible. My father went to prison, my brother went to prison, and I think they're more traumatizing than anything, and they're really outdated and obsolete. So I would say I'm pretty much against prisons, and I think that there are better ways of dealing with society's ills than sending folks to prison. I think a lot of times that can make the issue worse.
Yeah, what happens to families and communities, kids, women, partners, when people are pulled out of the community and sent to prison for decades?
Well, a lot of times it just has a detrimental effect overall. I think a lot of families suffer because it's a financial burden. Once you take a parent out of the picture, they could be the breadwinner of the household. The family tends to suffer financially and then emotionally as well, mentally. For kids who have their parents taken away when they're young, I think they're more inclined to have mental health issues into adulthood. It also just severs those ties completely. My father was incarcerated in another state, so it was hard to visit. It costs so much to even talk on the phone when your family member's in prison. I don't even know how to really say it. I honestly don't even think we're fully aware of the effects that this will have on our communities and societies, because a lot of people don't talk about it. And that's part of where my work as someone who did have a parent in prison comes in, is because 1 in 9 Black children will have a parent in prison. Wow. And so we're raising generations and generations of kids who are separated from their parents. And I don't think we are fully aware of the effects, but I would say financial, emotional, mental, all those things, it takes a toll on you.
Yeah. Were you able to have any kind of relationship with him while he was in prison?
I was. So my dad and I, we would write letters back and forth to each other. So I was probably like in elementary school, but that's how I kept in contact with them, and I still hold on to those letters. Yeah, I would send pictures. We didn't really talk on the phone because of the cost. That was never really an option. I never saw my dad when he was in prison, only letters, but it goes to show that you can maintain that relationship if both parties are still determined, no matter how hard the prison system tries to separate you. I think where there's love present on both sides, you can still maintain that relationship.
Yeah, you mentioned cost, which is just one of the, I mean, the whole thing is so sick and broken, but I think the fact that we have such a big industry around where people are profiting from imprisoning people on the scale that we are in this country, I would assume that's a huge part of why we're having such a hard time, like, shifting these laws right now.
Yep. Yes, definitely. There's been entire industries created to serve the purpose of incarcerating people. I know in upstate New York, they talk about how a lot of people get jobs because of the prisons, and it's totally messed up how we are looking to make profit from people's subjugation. We hear a lot about how, like, slavery is over, but in a sense, we're still enslaving people because we're making them work for free. But in a lot of ways, incarceration, punishment has been so normalized in our society, so it's hard for people to think about a world that doesn't have that. And I think a lot of it starts from when we're young, like when we're kids in school. A lot of times, if you're getting in trouble so much in school, you eventually start to go to juvenile detention centers. And then from there, you go to jail. So we really have to think of other ways of dealing with behaviors. Punishment is not always the answer to society's ills. The way that we're doing it is really inhumane, and it goes to show that some people in our society are given room to make mistakes, and they're given room to start over again. But then some folks, if you make one mistake, then that could be a fatality for you. You could be in jail for the rest of your life. I've heard stories of folks who, you know, they get caught with a joint and they're sentenced to like life in prison. And it's so messed up. But unfortunately, you're right. A lot of the reason why we haven't undone this is because the powers, you know, who control all this stuff, they are motivated by profit, and that's all they care about.
Well, it seems like it's not like there aren't working models of how we might do this. Like, wasn't it Portugal totally decriminalized all substances like 15 years ago, and they have like almost no overdoses, and their rates of HIV are way lower. And like there are, it seems like if we really cared, there are models that we could look at for how to do this.
Oh yeah, definitely. Portugal. I actually visited Portugal last year and met with a lot of folks who were involved in that work. And I know the Czech Republic also decriminalized a lot of their drugs. And it was actually really interesting being in Portugal. We were talking to like one of the health ministers at like one of the clinics there that help people who are struggling with addiction and drug use. And there's kind of a language barrier, but like not too great that we couldn't understand each other, but just like minor things. And I remember someone from our group saying like, oh, well, what do you do about moms with kids who come here who need help? Do you take the kids away? And the person meant, do you take the kids away like we do at Child Protective Services and put the kid in the foster home? And the health minister goes, oh, yeah, of course we take the kids away. Like, duh. And someone was like, no, like, do you take them out of the mother's custody? And he was like, no, why would we do that? Like, that's terrible. That would make things worse for her. We, like, provide childcare, but we don't separate families for this reason. And it was a moment where you just saw the disconnect in how our government views parents who use drugs or just people in general who use drugs versus like their health minister. And it made me think that we need a more holistic approach when it comes to everything in our society, but definitely drug use, families. We need to start thinking more about how to keep families and communities together. So, we definitely have the models to look at. It's just about, are we ready to take that step?
Yeah. I wonder if you have any insight on this moment too right now where we have this sort of like split personality disorder of like some states, there are people opening dispensaries where they're making gobs of money legally off of selling cannabis. And then we have a prison population where, like you said, people are away for most of their lives because of a joint. Like what do we do right now?
Well, that's a great question. And I'm happy to see people asking this question more because it shows that they're paying attention and they're involved, and more and more folks every day are realizing that this whole drug war thing is completely wrong. I think it starts on the small level, like city level, municipal level, where we have to start organizing and interacting with our elected officials and saying we need more compassion for people who use drugs. And we also, at the same time, need to repair the harms because a lot of these institutions have been complicit in the war on drugs. So you can look at the education industry, housing, public housing. A lot of those institutions have harmed people as well because of the war on drugs.
How so?
So, for example, if you have like a drug charge in certain states, you're not eligible for public housing. Or if you are a college student and you get caught on campus with drugs, depending on how it's handled, you could lose your scholarships or financial aid. And it can also be difficult for you to apply to college again after that. So we need to start having these conversations in our schools, in our churches, communities, and keep banging people over the head with it, because there's going to be a lot of people who just want to legalize weed and make money off of it and not talk about folks still being in prison because of this. It's important that we follow the money, follow where all the money's going, who's funding a lot of these weed businesses. And if you are a person who's like an organizer, I think it's important to urge your elected officials to include like some type of reparative justice component in your state's policy around marijuana legalization or drug decrim. That needs to be included. It's not enough to just legalize weed. You have to repair the harms. Otherwise, in 20, 30, 40 years, it's going to be something else that people are going to get arrested for. So we just really need to think about prisons and also repairing the harms.
Yeah. What's happening in New York right now?
So New York is one of those states where you must pass laws through both the state house and the state senate, as opposed to states like California where you can create a ballot measure and everyone votes on it. So what's happening in New York right now is that we've been trying to push for a legalization bill that includes a reparative justice component that allows for the communities that have been most harmed by marijuana prohibition. So all the neighborhoods and cities that have dealt with stop and frisk and the increased arrests and small possession charges over the past 10 years, what we want to do is give the money made from the legal cannabis industry to those communities, allowing folks who have records but want to get in the legal industry, want to get rid of those records and also give them opportunities to have a job or own a business. We also want to help people seal their records and overall just investing in those communities. So giving those communities the money that they need to make up for all the harm, all the policing, all the separation and violence that took place because of marijuana prohibition.
Wow, that's so exciting.
Yeah, it is exciting, but I think it's been hard for my policy colleagues to get that bill through both the state Senate and the House and get Governor Cuomo's approval. I feel like New York City is one place, but then the rest of the state is different, and I think a lot of people are nervous about marijuana being legalized. But at the same time, I would be less nervous about that and more nervous about the fact that there are still people in prison because of these things. And in the past, probably like 15 years, there's been like 800,000 people arrested just for marijuana charges. So there needs to be action taken now, and we don't have time to waste with this.
It's unconscionable that there would be one person still in prison while other people are making money legally.
Yep, and I was actually reading some marijuana facts today about New York specifically and also New York City specifically, and just reading the numbers about how much money they invest into policing for drug offenses. It's like, I forgot the exact number, but over like a 10-year span, they spent like $60 million. Don't quote me on that, but I can get you the facts later. But yeah, you see all this money that they're putting into it, and you're like, this is atrocious. It doesn't make any sense. When we talk about all the homeless kids and teenagers in this city, all the homeless adults, $65 million could go towards affordable housing or universal income or healthcare. It could go to something completely different and more useful and beneficial to our communities, but policing is the priority. So,
wow.
Yeah.
I wonder if, because the country is going about this by legalizing substances instead of decriminalizing completely across the board. I mean, on one hand, can see how it's a good thing because there's kind of a domino effect. Like there are psilocybin laws on the books in Oregon right now. But do we also sort of run the risk of like reinforcing this hierarchy of substances?
Yeah, I think with legalization, that can definitely happen. We still have a ton of work to do around unpacking that stigma around other substances. What I find a lot of times in my work is that everyone's on board with marijuana.
Right.
But then when you start talking about heroin or meth or cocaine or something, people start to be like, I was with you, but now I'm not. People can be really, really cruel to those drug users. And yeah, so there's already this hierarchy among folks who are cannabis users who are like, oh, well, it's not a drug. If we ever post any type of harm reduction materials on cannabis, people are like, how dare you? It's totally harmless. It can never hurt anyone. So we have a lot of work to do around unpacking that drug hierarchy, because any drug, any substance can harm you. So yeah, I do think that legalization, in terms of like public discourse, can make folks think like, oh, well, weed's okay, but all this other stuff, y'all are going too far, But honestly, there's such a big urgency for us to do work around all the other drugs too, because people are actually dying from that. And one of the things we have to talk about is that it's not necessarily always the drugs that are killing them, it's the way that folks are using and the conditions in which they're using, and also the lack of public health infrastructure around drug use in America. So DPA, we do a lot of work around harm reduction for preventing overdose, preventing Hep C, HIV, AIDS. Harm reduction is just really about meeting people where they're at and not judging them on their conditions and judging them for what they use and how they use. It's about saving lives, no matter who you are.
What are the biggest factors that are preventing that from happening in the way it's set up right now?
So a lot of it's lawmakers. We've been doing a lot of work around safe consumption spaces, which is basically something that we see in Europe and Canada that has shown to be effective for preventing overdose deaths. So that's something that we've been pushing for in San Francisco, New York, and we've just run into a lot of like, okay, we're with you, from like the mayors of these cities or city councilmen. Some of them are on board, but then it's just really hard to push to get that in fruition. Like, I think a lot of people are very turned off by it because it's a new concept to them. But honestly, if people are in a space where there's someone sober supervising them with a medical background who has paraphernalia that's not contaminated and that hasn't been used, that's going to prevent a lot more people from overdosing and using drugs that could be cut with things like fentanyl. Some of my colleagues here, they always say, like, would you rather someone be shooting up in a McDonald's bathroom or in one of these safe consumption spaces where they're being supervised, they're not impeding on anyone else's day. So a lot of public officials some are on board, but then a lot are just like, this is a very out there radical concept. And it is, because for so long our government has fed us the whole using drugs is bad, you're a bad person if you use them, something's wrong with you if you use them, and you deserve whatever bad happens to you if you use them. And so that's one of the things we're working on. We've done other work around like syringe access, because a lot of times what you see is Hep C and HIV/AIDS being transmitted through like repeated use of needles, and we do a lot of different things around harm reduction. I would say that's like another big bulk of our work here besides marijuana.
Wow, so important. So I want to ask you about psychedelics.
Okay.
Because I feel like they exist in a little bit of like their own special area right now, because they're illegal, but they're also like coming into the zeitgeist again in this way that's more acceptable than, say, like crack cocaine or heroin. And it's still implicitly part of like the racism that is at the root of all of this. So, and I'm very aware as a white person that psychedelics have been a huge part of my personal healing, that like I've had access in ways that a lot of people haven't because of my privilege. So I'm wondering what you're seeing in psychedelic communities right now in this context.
Yeah, so I think DPA as an organization, we've been working on developing more content and more work around psychedelics, gearing towards a more all-drug decrim focus now. So that would include psychedelics. We find that a lot of times people actually aren't as receptive to psychedelics being decriminalized.
Really?
Especially, one of my colleagues did a lot of messaging research, and so he was saying that psychedelics like psilocybin, LSD, oftentimes people react similarly to like crack cocaine. So I agree that there is like in the mainstream a lot more focus on it, but I think folks aren't necessarily in favor of decriminalizing or legalizing. But we are seeing more and more folks learn about psychedelics and also do some policy work around psychedelics. I know there are a couple psilocybin initiatives coming out of like Denver and Oregon, and I heard there's one coming out of Oakland, California.
Wow.
So that should be interesting how it plays out. I'm still a little wary on like the legal side of it, especially it's like I know Oregon, they're doing a totally different approach than Denver is. I think Denver is more focused on decriminalization, whereas Oregon is trying to make almost like a network of folks who are approved, like psilocybin dispensers, or I don't even know the word for it. So maybe that will bring more awareness to the benefits of like psilocybin mushrooms. But I also think that we should focus on all drug decrim, just because there's not a lot of arrest data on psychedelics. Like there's not a lot of arrest data on like who gets arrested for LSD, psilocybin, just because a lot of those drugs are way more difficult to scope out. A lot of them don't really appear on drug tests. They don't have a smell. A lot of times you could be more discreet with them. And because they're not as popular as like alcohol or weed, there's not a heavy focus on criminalizing them. You can be criminalized for using psychedelics, but that's certainly not the focus of police. I think certain drugs have been racialized and associated with certain groups, and so that's who police go after. And I think that dates back to like the early 1900s. Like cocaine was associated with black folks, marijuana was associated with Mexicans, and opium was associated with Chinese immigrants. And so a lot of our criminalization is, like you said, rooted in that racism towards those different groups. But I don't think psychedelics have been racialized in that same way. So it'll be interesting to see how those initiatives in California and Denver and Oregon play out. And then, of course, there's the medicalization side with MAPS. And they have been doing the FDA-approved clinical trials for MDMA-assisted psychotherapy for folks with PTSD. And I don't really know where they are on that. I know that they're like in phase 3, which I think is the final phase. But I think that should also be interesting to see. I know folks have really been bringing up and harping on the whole issue of accessibility. Questions like, who will this psychotherapy be available to? Will folks who are the most traumatized, the folks who come from marginalized communities, have access to it? I think that's an important question, especially given our healthcare system here in America. It already excludes a lot of poor folks. It's already a mess to navigate. But I think that's a really important question, because if you look at the history of this country, a lot of us are descendants from people who were the most traumatized people who were treated like animals and not given rights, and we had to fight for our rights. So I think it is an important question to bring up, because a lot of us are carrying this intergenerational trauma with us, and I think that's why folks are drawn to psychedelics, because it can be transformational. But I do think it's important to ask these questions along the way. Who can access this? Will folks from marginalized communities feel comfortable in these like very like white academic medical environments? So yeah, the psychedelic world is interesting. And I know I've also been hearing a lot more, just like in this year and last year alone, about people just doing the ayahuasca tourism, which is really interesting, because when I first got into psychedelics like 5 years ago, I was mostly just hearing Peru and Colombia. Now I'm hearing Costa Rica, and I'm hearing folks in New York are paying to do this in people's apartments. I had someone tell me, they're like, I think it was ayahuasca. I don't actually know.
Oh my God.
I think I was getting ripped off or something like that. So it's very interesting to see how ayahuasca has totally like spread from, you know, this sacred ceremony in South America to just like, it's like a rite of passage for folks now. And I'm not against people having ayahuasca ceremonies. I just think, you know, we need to be conscious and aware of like, where is the ceremony coming from? Like, whose culture are we participating in? And what is the power dynamic present? I think that's really important.
Because those medicines were subject to colonialism at the very beginning of Western culture arriving here.
Yeah, and that's something that, you know, we need to unpack more. It's like the impact of these colonial laws have had on everything from how we dress, how we talk, to the substances we use in our cultural practices and ceremonies. I think we scratched the surface on it, but I feel like that could be someone's thesis.
Yeah.
But it's fascinating to me, and it's something that I want to learn more about myself. Colonialism and history is one thing, but then talking about drugs and colonialism, I think that's something that academics can kind of shy away from, is like accepting that drugs can be fun, and even outside of psychedelics, like drugs can be fun if and people have used them forever, and it doesn't make you a bad person.
It's like a fundamental part of humanness to mess with our consciousness, it seems like.
Yeah, exactly. It's very normal. I remember our old founder, Ethan Nadelman, he put it in a really good way. He said, when you're a kid and you're on the playground, sometimes we just like stand around and just spin around in circles so you get dizzy. And you're like, after you stop spinning, you're like kind of feeling out of control. And it made me think of like, whoa, I never thought about that being a way to alter my consciousness. But in a way it is, because it's like 5 seconds, but it still makes you feel like super dizzy really, really quickly. So yeah, it's definitely a part of the human experience, and we do it in so many ways. I think most of us use some type of drug in some capacity in our lives. Caffeine, alcohol, sugar, all those things alter your consciousness, and it's all about what's stigmatized versus what isn't, what's accepted, what's seen as okay,
and who's making those decisions and what their motives are behind it.
Right, exactly. It's fascinating to me that something like mushrooms or cannabis, you know, they're plants, but we have so many laws around them. We have so many people in prison because of a plant. It just doesn't make any sense, and it makes me feel like our society's really backwards.
Well, you mentioned at the beginning that these laws were specifically targeting people who were, you know, quote unquote, rebelling in various ways because they wanted civil rights and they wanted justice. So it does seem like it's not just sort of like paranoid hippie talk to say that like these plants do help people align themselves more with justice and human good. So
yeah, I think in like 50 years we're gonna look back on this whole war on drugs and be like, what in the world was that? Why did we do that? Why did we ruin so many lives and take so much time away from people? I think we're gonna look back on this time and be really ashamed about it.
Are there people that you're looking to for leadership and how we move forward? Because like before we started recording, I mentioned that Michael Pollan seems to be like a big figure in the psychedelic space right now, which like he serves his purpose and he has his audience and he can sort of be a Trojan horse in a way. But like, I really don't feel like another white man is like what we need right now. I'm wondering if you could suggest some resources.
Resources. Yeah, I think there's people out there who are doing work around psychedelics who are people who can make this knowledge easily accessible and who are working in their communities. About 4 years ago, I met a woman named Kai Wingo, and she was a urban farmer, mycologist based in Cleveland, Ohio, and she was a mother of 3, and she organized the Women and Entheogens Conference. And it was probably the blackest psychedelic event I ever went to in my life. Her urban farm was right there in the middle of Cleveland.
Whoa.
She would have all these different types of mushrooms growing. She had her children involved. She had 3 teenage kids, and they were all involved in learning how to grow mushrooms. Unfortunately, Kai passed away a few years ago, so she's no longer with us. But I think that her legacy is really important, and that you don't have to make psychedelics super medical or academic to help people learn about it. It can be just a community-based conversation where folks are just talking about trauma and our experiences and telling each other how we've healed and how we've used these type of plant medicines. So I really like Kai. And then there's other folks. One person who I like listening to is Kalindi E. He's a high-dose mushroom aficionado. He's based in Detroit, but his focus is mostly mushrooms and other psychedelics, but he talks a lot about how to use psychedelics in a way that's going to be transformational. He always says, like, do psychedelics at night and go in your room and lay down on the floor and just be naked and just let them take their course. I still haven't tried it yet, but but it sounds pretty amazing. And I know that he's done a lot of events in the Detroit community and all over the world. And he also is very into mixed martial arts, so I think that's just cool in general.
Yeah.
And then one of my friends, her name is Paula Khan, and she works with a group, or she founded her own group called Cosmic Ancestors Visions in Spanish. My Spanish is bad. But she founded that group to kind of organize folks who are from more the Latin American perspective about psychedelics. So she's a part of the People of Color Psychedelics Coalition, and she's brought in Inti Garcia, who is from Mexico, Oaxaca specifically. And Inti, he has like a whole archive of Maria Sabina, who's like the curandera, who is the reason why mushrooms got popularized in the U.S. So his father was a radio DJ, and he has pictures, videos, all these materials that are from the Mazatec people and their culture, and he's very knowledgeable about how they use psilocybin mushrooms in their culture, and it's really fascinating because they're just so normalized. He started taking it when he was probably like a teenager, probably like 13. And to me, that's fascinating. It's cool because I believe that, especially for boys, that can be really, really powerful. And I asked him, like, well, how was it as a 13-year-old taking mushrooms? And he was just saying it just made him understand his experiences more. It made him understand love, and I thought that was amazing. And I've heard of other folks having kids participate. And I think that can be really helpful. Of course, like any substance, you have to take certain precautions, but I think in the right setting, it can be beneficial for children as well. Yeah. And so I think there's just like a lot of knowledge out there that's not necessarily in like the academic space of psychedelics that can be really impactful for folks. I'm a person who neither one of my parents graduated with a bachelor's or advanced degree. My grandma stopped going to school probably like 8th grade. And I think that folks tend to forget that academia doesn't connect with a lot of people, and it has its own issues. And I think the most effective way in terms of like educating people is just to talk to them about their experiences and listen. Listening is super underrated. And there's folks out here who are doing the work in their communities to educate folks, to be someone's trip sitter, to help someone integrate. I have another friend who's in my group. His name is Dwayne David. He is in my hometown of Charleston, South Carolina, and he does some work around dream states and altered states of consciousness. So he created a group in Charleston where it's just a support group of folks who come together to talk about different types of dreaming and also like some psychedelic stuff thrown in there. So I think it's really about just creating spaces for folks to come and like learn and make it easy. You know, everyone can't go to a conference and pay hundreds of dollars and pay for a hotel and travel. We need to think about ways to make this information accessible. We have the internet, we have social media, we have webcams all over the place. So I think there's no excuse. If you're organizing a psychedelic event and everyone in the space looks the same, then you're not doing something right. And you need to think about that and not make excuses about it. Yeah.
So well said. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Well, one thing I think will be interesting, and I'm continuing to hear conversations around sexual violence, harassment, that type of thing in psychedelic spaces. And I think that that's something that's going to continue to come up. I know there's an event coming up in a few weeks at the New School around consent and psychedelics. In my experience, people don't talk about it enough and are very casual and just make a lot of assumptions and tend to normalize it, but we really need to unpack this whole notion of altered states of consciousness and sex. Yeah. And understanding power dynamics present. I've certainly been in spaces where folks would try to offer me psychedelics as a way to kind of disarm me. And I've also heard a ton of stories of that happening to different people. Folks who are in positions of power, folks who are therapists, psychiatrists, just basically taking advantage of people. And it's really frightening because I think so many folks in the psychedelic space want to come off as super enlightened and super zen, and you know, no one's above anything. We're all people, we all make mistakes, and we can all be that toxic person. But I hate that I have to say this, but it's totally wrong to like try to use psychedelics to get in someone's pants.
Yeah.
That's totally messed up, and I hate that I even have to say that because you would think people just know that off the bat, but I have to say it because it keeps happening in the community. I've heard of people being taken advantage of, and I'm tired of hearing about it. I'm tired of having to see people totally have their careers and their livelihoods diverted because of a few predators in the community. And I think that we need to create some systems of accountability. And it also connects to the whole abolition thing, right? Like, how do we reconcile wanting to punish people who commit these acts of violence but not putting them in prison? Are there ways to do that? And that's where I'm stuck. I'm still trying to navigate that in my own mind. But that's going to be a continuing conversation in psychedelics. There's this notion that, okay, if you use psychedelics, if you ingest 3.5 grams of mushrooms, you have your trip, you survive, and that's all the work you need to do, right? But any type of healing is going to be holistic. It has to be holistic. Even if you're not involving drugs. If you have depression or bipolar disorder, okay, you're going to therapy, but therapy alone cannot be your healing. You have to do things outside of therapy. You may have to take medication. You may use psychedelics too, but healing is much more broad than just like using psychedelics and, okay, well, I'm healed, or oh, I'm zen, or I'm enlightened. It's a continuing process, and I think there's a lot of people who don't necessarily want to sit with that, like sit with the uncomfortableness, sit with their feelings or their experiences. And that can be said for things outside of psychedelics and outside of drugs, but there's like this instant gratification that folks want, and to me, you don't heal that way. You don't process anything that way. You have to really sit with things for months, maybe a year sometimes, depending on what you've been through. And I advise folks not to rush through anything, not to even rush through getting your hands on some psychedelics. Like, they'll come to you when it's your time, and I advise everyone to really think about what they're doing and be intentional about it.
Oh, I'm so glad that you brought that all up. Yeah. My partner comes from an evangelical community, and so we've been talking a lot recently about how positions of power in the evangelical church can be sort of this instantaneous superhighway to just like power in the community in general for men very specifically. And I've been thinking about that recently in quote unquote spiritual spaces, which I think has a lot of overlap with psychedelic spaces, and how, you know, predators will use tools however, but that is specifically like, I think it can be seen as sort of this shortcut to like, I've done XYZ chemicals and now I'm an expert, and now I'm gonna, you know, tell you about how you're gonna explore your consciousness. And yeah, it's just as, if not more vulnerable to predators than any community. So
that's the thing. When you are on, whether it be acid, mushrooms, ayahuasca, you're not in your normal state of consciousness, and it's pretty much impossible to consent, right? And what folks don't realize is that not only are you being traumatized by this, you know, act of violence, whatever they're doing, but your whole experience of using this substance is going to be colored by that trauma. So I've heard of people, I've had someone tell me once that they and their friends were using like acid all together one night, and their friends thought it would be funny to tell them to like kill themselves and commit suicide, and he was just so confused and like, what is going on? But it was a joke to them, but this guy told me that he was forever traumatized by that experience, and he wants to try psychedelics, but he's afraid because he still has this experience that he dealt with in the back of his mind. So you're being traumatized on like multiple levels, because whenever you try to even drink alcohol or smoke weed or whatever, you're always going to be in the back of your head thinking, I'm in a vulnerable position right now and I can't just enjoy myself anymore. I have to be careful about people taking advantage of me. So yeah, it's sinister on a lot of levels, and I don't understand that mindset at all, and I don't want to. But I think that there are things we can do to help folks who have been in these terrible situations heal, and I think we can create conversations around that and also put things in place so that it doesn't happen. Of course, rapists, abusers, they just need to stop. So if we could get a handle on that, that could be great, but obviously we would have our work cut out for us. So I think there are things we can do to make it so that everyone is responsible for each other in these spaces. You know, there's sexual assault bystander training. When you see things happening and it gives you a gut feeling, that's your moment to step up and say something. You can't just be complicit in things. And that's another thing, is not only do we have folks who are abusers, we have folks who are complicit and sometimes enable these people. Like, yes, it is, easier to sweep it all under the rug, but that doesn't mean it's good. And it doesn't do anyone good if we're letting this person be in our community but not really addressing the harm that they cause. So, yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much for talking about that. You wrote a really amazing article that I read as part of Symposia, had a series about inclusivity in psychedelic spaces, and I think reading that was the first time really that I had really thought about the fact that set and setting itself is a privilege. And that I have been really lucky that in my psychedelic experience, I've sort of known that from the beginning and have been in really safe spaces in order to be vulnerable. But it just really blew my perspective open how, you know, a lot of people haven't had the privilege to be even just like out of a city, you know, someplace in nature, but where to be in that vulnerable state, it's okay to really dwell there and let go of the armor that they've had to have. So
Yeah.
that was really, I feel very committed in my life now to creating spaces where people can come and be safe. And it just feels really important. So
Yeah, that's something I'm passionate about too, because I was very privileged to even also have a safe setting. The first time I tried mushrooms was when I was a student at Smith College in Massachusetts, and our campus was so pretty. It's the Arboretum. But I also recognize that a lot of people don't even go to college. A lot of people never leave their home state or their hometown. And when you are out, say in a place like New York doing drugs where there's cops everywhere, you are not only mentally in a vulnerable position, but these cops can still arrest you while you're tripping, you know, or it doesn't even, they don't even have to get you on a drug charge. They trump up charges all the time. So I see why a lot of people are nervous about using psychedelics, because first of all, where are you gonna do it? Like, you gotta carve out 6 to 8 hours of your day to trip. Some people can afford to do that. Some people have to work, but also you have to find a place where you're not gonna be bothered for that amount of time, while also being able to have a pleasurable experience. And so, the more marginalized you are, the more difficult it's gonna be to have that. If you're struggling with housing security, you don't have the space to do these type of things. If you are working a job that doesn't pay well, a lot of our wages are way too low for the society we live in, then you have to worry about, okay, do I need to go to work or can I trip today? Yeah. You know? And it's like, you have to make that choice between wanting to have fun or wanting to have a transformational experience or wanting to eat the next day. So, yeah, it is a very, very privileged position to be in, and that's something I don't take for granted, and that's why I'm so passionate about talking to people about this, because I know there are people who are curious, especially as psychedelics become more mainstream. We're hearing about cures for PTSD, depression, anxiety. Folks like me who come from working class communities in South Carolina, they deserve to know about these substances in a way that's not stigmatizing, but can also be healing for people. Yeah, so the psychedelic community in general can do a lot better in terms of bringing this work to the communities that need it the most. Yeah.
Yeah, I hope that can be part of the revolution from the beginning, you know.
Yeah, definitely. The psychedelic revolution.
That's right.
Oh man.
I just want it to be so much better than what happened in the 60s, you know? Like I want it to be lasting. I want it to like reach people that need it. I hope we can do it right this time.
Yeah, definitely. And I think we underestimate the power of imagination sometimes. When you talk about prison abolition, something that I think Patrice Cullors from Black Lives Matter says a lot is like, we have to imagine a world without prisons. And for so many people, it's hard to think outside the box and think of new ways of envisioning our society. Like, it doesn't have to be this way. Obviously, if something's not working, we might as well just try something new. So many people they can recognize that something's not working, but at the same time, they're like, oh, I don't want to do anything about it. I'm comfortable, or this is how it is. But I think psychedelics can help us start to envision a new society in terms of how do we want to take care of each other? How do we want our kids to grow up? How do we want our families to be structured? And then on top of that, we can think about what role do we want psychedelics to play in in this new society that we're envisioning. Do we want it to be easily accessible? Do we want it to be more of a rite of passage, ritualistic type thing? I think we need to spend more time in that space of like just imagining new things that we have been told as adults, like, oh no, like don't, like, we can't do that. I think adults are especially encouraged not to use their imagination and to just go with the flow of how like rigid our society is. And we can learn a lot from children in that aspect too. They're so imaginative and philosophical. Sometimes they ask so many questions, and we could do ourselves a service by asking ourselves questions about, well, does it have to be this way? Like, is it working? Okay, well, let's change it. Let's do something about it. Let's do something that makes everyone's lives easier, no one's dying, no one's being harmed. And it's not as hard as people make it seem to be.
What could be more worthwhile than that?
Right, exactly, because we're going against time right now, especially with climate change, and it's becoming more and more of a issue that we can't ignore. We shouldn't ignore it. And I think that's where we have to start, is thinking about our relationship with ourselves and the earth in general. Psychedelics have taught me to practice more gratitude towards the earth and towards plants and people. My first time taking mushrooms, I saw like plants breathing and glistening, and I was kind of overwhelmed by the beauty, but at the same time I was like enamored by it, and it just made me realize that everything that we need is here on earth, and we don't necessarily have to do a complete overhaul, but look at what people did in the past and blend that with the future. Yeah, but psychedelics have definitely, changed my perspective in terms of gratitude from people as well. People come into your life and we can take them for granted, or we can choose not to, because everything comes at a cost. Even taking mushrooms, like we took that from a plant, and we should practice gratitude towards the plant too, and not just have these relationships that are, okay, well, it's mine, or, I don't know. I'm kind of rambling now.
No, I'm so glad you are. Yeah. Because it's not like we shouldn't take the transactional way that we're used to interacting in capitalism into these spaces with us. Yeah.
I think there's a way to be transactional, but not necessarily capitalistic, like it's just basic manners and gratitude. If someone gives you something, you say thank you, or you do something for them in return later on. You definitely don't want to take from something, but you don't want to not help its own livelihood. So if you're taking from these plants, but not helping fertilize the soil, not watering them, then that's unsustainable. And I think that's what a lot of our corporations and industries have been doing to the earth for so long. And that's why we're seeing such a dramatic change in climate nowadays, and we can't ignore it. So maybe psychedelics will help with that too.
I hope so. I hope they can at least be part of the process.
Yes.
Yeah.
Can give some psychedelics to the climate deniers and change their mind. No, just kidding.
Well, thank you so much for your time and for your perspective. It's invaluable, and I'm really grateful for the work that you're doing.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. I really enjoyed the conversation.
Thank you.
Yay.
This is life.
Thank you for joining us today. I'm so grateful that Ife Tayo shared her story, and also a vision for where we're going that's better than what we've been doing now. I really believe that all of us can be part of that vision and that solution, and that psychedelics and plant medicines can absolutely be our allies if we call them in responsibly. If you want to connect with Ife Tayo, I definitely suggest you check out the Drug Policy Alliance and Symposia. Both those websites have so many resources, and you can also find all of her writing online at ifetayo.strikingly.com. She has a wealth of articles there and other conversations that she's had. You can, of course, always get in touch with me, maurajames.com, and on Instagram at maurajames. This is a reminder to be each other's community. If you're able, in whatever way you are able, with whatever health and resources and opportunity and perspective you have, hold space for each other. Share your resources. Share your experiences. Talk about the medicines that have been working for you, psychedelic or not. I think about how many times I was exposed to the idea of mushrooms before I finally thought, oh, maybe that's not just something for other people, maybe that's something for me too, because the conditioning of the drug war is really deep for all of us. We're all victims of it because it's a form of consciousness that has really successfully pervaded our communities at every level. And there's a huge opportunity right now for us all to combat that, for us all to be part of the undoing. And transparency is a cheap option that is available to all of us right now to start talking about our relationships to these medicines. And sidebar, hell yes, cannabis is a gateway drug, because once you experience it, you think, oh, this is what they were scaring me about? I mean, what else were they just completely wrong about? I try to be transparent about my experiences because as a white, well-educated woman in this country, I'm an incredible beneficiary of privilege that has made my experiences of psychedelics relatively safe and protected. And I think we have the opportunity to disarm people by being transparent about our experiences. And I mean, I can't tell you how many Lyft drivers now I've ended up talking about psychedelics. I've had pretty liberal work environments because I've mainly worked in the film industry for the last 10 years. But I was on set the other day where I ended up talking to the G&E team about ayahuasca, and I'd like to think that's not because I'm pushy about it, but because I try to make myself available, and the spirits that need exposure to that knowledge and that medicine will come if I make myself available to share it. So if you're someone that has it to share, give it away. And if you're someone that's seeking that signal and seeking more knowledge and experience, a wise, wild woman that I met in New Mexico last year named Bet Williams once said, what you're looking for is a mushroom. It's between you and the mushroom, so go find a mushroom and go eat a mushroom. If you're ready, if you're looking for it, if it's time, turn each other on, be each other's resource. We don't have to stand for predators in our psychedelic spaces, be they individuals or institutions. And maybe challenge yourself this week, if there's one thing to take away from this conversation. Maybe challenge yourself to be transparent with a friend or a family member about an experience, doesn't have to be psychedelic, that has changed your life for the better, and that you maybe feel shy about sharing because it's weird or out of the norm, or nobody else has talked to you about a similar experience. Share something that if somebody shared it with you, it would make you feel less alone. Be safe, hold each other, be responsible for each other, and give each other places to be vulnerable and to be seen. That is a gift that we take with us everywhere we go, and we can always give it. I love you. I'll see you next week.